The fire was no accident. Neighbors stood outside in silence as flames devoured the home of a black father named David Carter, a man known for his quiet dignity and unshakable work ethic. The air smelled of smoke and fear, but beneath it was something colder, the certainty that this was no random tragedy. In the middle of that crowd was a woman whose glare had followed David for months. Her name was Karen Whitmore, the president of the neighborhood's homeowners association. She had filed complaint after complaint, each one dripping with hostility, masked as rules. Grass too long, paint not neutral enough, cars parked 1 inch too far over the line. And when David did not bend, when he refused to shrink under her watchful eye, she escalated. That night, while the world slept, his house became her final warning. What Karen did not know, could not know, was that this act of destruction would set into motion something she could never control. Weeks later, as David walked into the courthouse to resume his work as a newly appointed judge, he found himself staring at a familiar face across the room. The same woman who had tormented him, who had reduced his children to tears, who had lit the match that destroyed his family's home, now stood trembling before his bench. The irony was cinematic, but the weight was real. This was not just neighbor against neighbor. It was a test of power, principle, and the very fabric of justice. The question was not whether Karen would be punished. The evidence was mounting. The question was what David would do with the power now in his hands. Would he seek revenge cloaked as justice, or would he rise above, turning the flames that burned his house into a fire that purified something larger than himself? Here's what that moment teaches us. Life will place us in situations where those who harmed us are suddenly vulnerable before us. It is in those moments that character is revealed. A single action flipped the entire outcome. And in that silent courtroom, with everyone watching, David Carter had to decide what story history would tell about him. Before the flames, before the courtroom, David Carter was simply a man trying to build stability for his family. He had grown up in a neighborhood where the law felt more like a predator than a shield, where black men were told in subtle and brutal ways to know their place. His response was to master the very system that tried to contain him. He studied relentlessly, earned his law degree, and worked his way from public defender to respected attorney. His reputation was not built on theatrics, but on a steady presence, the kind of man juries leaned toward because they sensed his integrity. It was this consistency that earned him his recent appointment to the bench, a position he accepted with quiet humility rather than public celebration. When he and his wife bought their home in the suburban enclave of Westbrook Meadows, they believed. It was the culmination of years of sacrifice. The house was modest compared to many in the neighborhood, but it represented something priceless: safety, permanence, and the ability to show their children that stability was possible. What David did not know was that the neighborhood carried its own unspoken rules, policed not only by property lines but by the people who claimed ownership of the culture inside its gates. Karen Whitmore had lived there for decades, and as president of the Homeowners Association, she wielded her authority with a smile that never reached her eyes. On paper, she enforced order. In practice, she enforced exclusion. Every letter she sent to David's family carried the same message in different words: "You do not belong here." When his children played basketball in the driveway, she cited noise, violations. When his wife planted bright marigolds, she wrote that the colors violated the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony. It was not about rules. It was about control. Psychologists call this dynamic the abuse of positional power, when someone uses an assigned role not to protect but to dominate. Karen embodied this fully. Yet David, trained in restraint, often chose silence. He knew that confronting her directly would play into stereotypes she was waiting to confirm. But silence has a cost. Each ignored letter, each tolerated insult, each microaggression he endured without protest, fed into a cycle where her hostility grew bolder. She did not know it yet, but her campaign was awakening something in David. The man who had spent his career defending others was being forced to consider what it meant to defend himself. And when the night of the fire came, it was no longer just about burned walls. It was about decades of unspoken battles in every black household that ever tried to claim space in places that quietly resisted them. The match was lit, but the deeper fire had been smoldering for years. The night after the fire, David sat in a borrowed chair at his sister's kitchen table, staring into the dim glow of a single lamp. His children were asleep in the next room, their small bodies curled into uneasy rest. His wife had cried until silence replaced tears, and he, the man who was supposed to carry answers, the man newly sworn to uphold justice, felt a weight pressing against his chest that words could not release. The insurance company would ask questions, investigators would comb through ashes, neighbors would whisper theories. But he already knew what his heart refused to say aloud. Karen was behind this. It was in that silence where the fork in the road appeared. One path was vengeance. A man with his legal knowledge, his network, his understanding of the system, could find ways to crush her in court, to bury her under the weight of consequences that mirrored the destruction she had inflicted on him. He could let rage take the wheel and steer justice toward punishment that looked like retribution. The other path was restraint. To trust the slow, grinding gears of due process, to believe that evidence would rise, that truth would surface, that fairness could still triumph even in a system that rarely leaned in favor of men who looked like him. But that path came with its own danger, the risk of looking weak, of letting his children believe that people could strip away their home and face no reckoning. Here's the tension. Psychology teaches us that humans, confronted with betrayal, often experience what researchers call moral injury. It is not just the act of harm, but the rupture of belief that justice is possible. In that kitchen, David was not only grieving his home, but questioning whether the principles he had built, his life upon, were strong enough to hold in the face of such hatred. His wife placed a hand on his arm and whispered, "Do not let her decide who you become." That single sentence pulled him back from the edge. He realized that every action he took would echo through his children, through his career, through the people silently watching how he would respond. She did not know it yet, but Karen had handed David a test far greater than fire. This was about whether he would be consumed by her hatred or whether he would transform it into something larger. The fork was clear. The choice was not yet. In the days after the fire, David returned to his routine with a quietness that fooled most of the neighborhood. To them, he was just another displaced homeowner, waiting on insurance claims and investigators. But beneath that still exterior, something deliberate was unfolding. For years, David had carried a habit that few noticed. He observed everything. In courtrooms, he read not only words but posture, tone, and the small betrayals of expression. As a neighbor, he had cataloged every smirk, every glance, every accidental encounter with Karen. She believed her campaign of harassment lived in isolated complaints, but David had been collecting a trail. Every letter, every voicemail, every message scrawled on official HOA stationery was filed and dated. She didn't know it yet, but he had built a record that would one day matter. Psychologists call this strategic patience, the ability to resist the impulse of immediate reaction and instead gather information until the timing is undeniable. While others erupted in anger or retreated in defeat, David chose the third path, to prepare. That preparation was his hidden power. Because behind every instance of humiliation was documentation. Behind every silence was evidence being stacked like quiet bricks. There was also his training. As a defense attorney, he had spent years dismantling hostile narratives. He understood that people like Karen thrived on perception. Neighbors would think of her as a rule enforcer, not a persecutor. But perception could shift the moment evidence painted a fuller picture. He also knew the psychology of escalation, that when aggressors are unchecked, They reveal themselves more fully. Karen was predictable, and predictability could be leveraged. The first glimpse of reversal came quietly. A detective working the arson case mentioned inconsistencies in Karen's alibi. A neighbor's security camera caught her car circling near David's home that night. It was not enough to indict, but it was enough to confirm what David already knew. The storm was moving toward her. Here's what that moment teaches us. Power is not always loud. Sometimes it is the quiet accumulation of truth, the discipline to wait while others expose themselves. David's hidden strength was not in striking first, but in knowing when to let silence speak until the system caught up. The match had burned. His house, but her arrogance was lighting a fuse beneath her own feet. The first shift had begun. When the investigators' preliminary report came back, David expected clarity. Instead, it delivered a familiar sting. Insufficient evidence to determine suspect at this time. Karen's name was nowhere in the report. To the public eye, the fire was a tragic accident. For David, it felt like déjà vu. The same system he had defended and worked within now seemed blind to the obvious. Neighbors whispered sympathy but hesitated to take sides. A few even suggested the fire might have been caused by faulty wiring. Karen leaned into this narrative, hosting an emergency HOA meeting where she expressed deep concern for community safety. She spoke with such practiced innocence that some nodded along, forgetting the history of hostility she had directed toward David's family. It was as if her performance was rewriting reality in real time. This was the breaking point. Not because of the fire itself, but because David watched his children overhear those whispers. His son asked him, "Dad, why does no one believe us?" That question sliced deeper than flames ever could. For the first time, David felt humiliation, not just as a man whose house was gone, but as a father unable to shield his children from the cruelty of denial. The system had not simply failed to act, it had publicly questioned the validity of his pain. Psychologists describe this moment as secondary trauma, when the failure of support systems deepens the wound of the original harm. Instead of feeling protected, victims are re-traumatized by disbelief, bureaucracy, or gaslighting. David carried the weight of this double injury. In the courtroom, he had fought to ensure others were heard. Now, stripped of his own home, he found his voice nearly dismissed. The pressure mounted further when a local newspaper published a short article framing the fire as an unfortunate accident. Karen was quoted as saying, "This is why we must all adhere to HOA safety standards." Her words implied fault without saying it outright. David realized he was being positioned not as a victim, but as a man whose own negligence might have brought the tragedy upon himself. It was the lowest point. The system was not only slow, it was complicit in reshaping the story against him. He had evidence, but evidence without amplification is silence. And as the walls closed in, David faced a haunting question. Could he really win against someone who had mastered both performance and perception? The breakdown was public, the humiliation complete. The night after the newspaper article, David returned to his office long after hours. He sat in the quiet glow of a desk lamp, surrounded by case files of clients he had once defended. Every folder told the story of someone who had felt powerless until someone believed in their truth. Now, for the first time in years, David questioned whether he could believe in his own. His hands hovered over the stack of evidence he had collected against Karen. The letters, the recordings, the security footage, but the humiliation still burned too deep for him to see a clear path forward. That was when a mentor figure arrived. Judge Langston, a retired jurist who had guided David through law school and remained a steady voice of reason in his life. Langston listened quietly as David poured out the weight of betrayal, the ache of his children's disillusionment, and the rage simmering beneath his restraint. After a long pause, the older judge leaned forward and said, David, the law is not just about punishing wrongs. It is about creating a record that truth existed, even when people tried to erase it. If you fight her with anger, you become the fire. But if you fight her with truth, you become the flame that light exposes everything. That single framing shifted something in David. Psychologists call it cognitive reframing. When you take the same situation and see it from a different perspective, altering not only your mindset, but your strategy. He realized that his humiliation could be weaponized, not against him, but against the narrative Karen was spinning. She thrived on perception. He would counter her with documentation so overwhelming, so undeniable, that even the slow gears of justice would be forced to move. From that night, David stopped reacting and started planning. He revisited his files, built timelines, and cross-referenced every incident with witness statements and public records. He reached out quietly to neighbors who had once shrugged in silence, and to his surprise, a few admitted they too had been targeted by Karen's manipulative tactics. One confession led to another. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Karen's abuse of authority was not isolated. It was systemic. Here's what that moment teaches us. Transformation does not always come with fire and thunder. Sometimes it comes as a whisper, a quiet sentence from someone who sees your strength before you do. A single insight flipped the entire outcome. David was no longer fighting for a house. He was fighting for a record of truth that could outlast both fire and rumor. The spark had been lit, and this time he controlled the flame. David knew that Karen expected him to lash out, to make a misstep that could be twisted into anger or instability. Instead, he chose invisibility. Weeks passed, and on the surface he appeared subdued, attending community meetings without argument, showing up to courtrooms with the same calm professionalism. But beneath that silence, he was building a case brick by brick. Each day, he devoted time to methodical preparation, assembling a timeline of harassment, matching complaints with witness testimony, collecting surveillance clips from neighbors, who, emboldened by his persistence, quietly began to hand him fragments of proof. What had once been a private war became a collective unveiling. Strategically, David leaned on what psychologists call incremental progress, the discipline of breaking a massive problem into small, achievable steps. Rather than seeking one dramatic moment of victory, he accumulated minor, nearly invisible wins. A notarized statement here, a subpoenaed document there, until his files grew too heavy for even the most skeptical official to ignore. He also studied Karen's patterns. At HOA meetings, she repeated the same language, the same veiled hostility dressed as policy. David began recording these moments, capturing her tone as much as her words. Over time, her control unraveled not through confrontation, but through exposure. One by one, neighbors who had once stayed silent began approaching him privately. A Latino family recalled being fined for decorations others displayed freely. An elderly couple admitted she had pressured them to repaint their door 3 times in a year. Each story became another thread in a tapestry of abuse that reached far beyond his own fire. David did not rush these revelations. He listened, documented, and added them to his growing archive. The quiet climb was agonizing at times. No headlines, no applause, just paperwork and patience. His children grew restless, asking when justice would come. He told them, "Sometimes the strongest walls are built stone by stone, not overnight." That lesson, though simple, carried the weight of a centuries of resilience, the slow, steady endurance Black families have had to embody in systems designed to erase their voices. Here's the power of this phase. By choosing silence and discipline over spectacle, David starved Karen of the chaos she thrived on. She believed he was diminished, broken by the fire. In truth, he was constructing a narrative she would never escape from. The execution was in motion, quiet but unstoppable. The climb had begun. The summit was near. The day of reckoning arrived, quietly, disguised as an ordinary court proceeding. David, now presiding as a judge, entered the courtroom with the same calm presence he always carried. But when he looked up from the bench and saw Karen Whitmore seated at the defense table, her composure cracking beneath the fluorescent lights, he knew the moment had arrived. She was no longer the gatekeeper of neighborhood rules. She was a defendant, charged with arson, fraud, and abuse of authority. The evidence David had quietly built had been woven into an airtight case by prosecutors. The letters, the witness, statements, the surveillance footage, the testimonies of other families she had tormented. Her empire of control had collapsed under the weight of undeniable truth. The courtroom was packed. Neighbors who once stayed silent now sitting shoulder to shoulder, whispering about the irony of it all. Karen, who had ruled over them with clipped smiles and threats of fines, was now the one facing judgment. Every word she spoke revealed her unraveling. She blamed faulty wiring, then hinted at vandals, then claimed she had been the real victim of harassment. But with each excuse, prosecutors produced another document, another recording, another voice. It was like watching a mask peel away in layers until nothing remained but raw fear. And then came the quietest moment, the reversal. As the judge, David had to recuse himself from ruling on her case directly. But in that instant, standing above the woman who once tried to erase him, he realized he did not need revenge to claim victory. The system, imperfect and slow as it was, had been forced to bend toward truth because he had insisted on patience, preparation, and persistence. Here's what that moment teaches us. True power is not the ability to destroy an enemy, but the discipline to let them destroy themselves under the weight of their own lies. The climax was not thunderous applause or a dramatic outburst. It was the silence in the room when everyone realized the balance of power had shifted permanently. Karen's reign of intimidation was over. The fire she set had not consumed David's dignity. It had consumed her credibility. A single action, his decision to document instead of retaliate, had flipped the entire outcome. When the verdict was read weeks later, guilty on multiple counts of arson, fraud, and malicious abuse of authority, the neighborhood felt as though a weight had been lifted. Karen Whitmore, once untouchable as HOA president, now faced sentencing. The very community she had ruled through fear began to breathe differently. Neighbors who had stayed silent in the past now spoke freely, sharing stories, regrets, and even apologies for not standing by David sooner. The fear of fines and letters was gone, replaced by a cautious solidarity born from witnessing truth prevail. But the aftermath was not simple. The house was still gone. The children still carried the memory of watching their world burn. And David himself knew that justice, while satisfying, could never fully restore what was lost. Yet something deeper had shifted. His family saw him, not only as a father who had endured, but as a man who had shown them that patience and principle could outlast even the most calculated cruelty. Redemption came not through revenge, but through the restoration of dignity, his own, and that of the families Karen had silenced. The system, too, took note. The case made local headlines, not because of the arson alone, but because it revealed a pattern of HOA abuse that extended far beyond Westbrook Meadows. Other communities began questioning their boards, examining whether rules were being used as tools of exclusion rather than fairness. The ripple effect of David's quiet resistance extended further than he ever imagined. By insisting on truth, he had ignited a broader conversation about power, bias, and accountability. Here's what that moment teaches us. Justice is rarely about restoring what was taken. It is about ensuring that harm does not have the final word. For David, the aftermath was not a victory in the conventional sense. It was transformation. He emerged not only as a man whose case had succeeded, but as a mentor figure in his own right, teaching his children and his community that the true measure of power is restraint guided by principle. As Karen was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, she finally understood what she had never believed possible. The man she thought she could erase had become the one who defined her downfall. And for David, the quiet victory was not her punishment, but the knowledge that he had shaped the story without letting hatred shape him. The fire was out, but its light remained. In the years that followed, the Carter family rebuilt their home, not just in wood and brick, but in spirit. The new house stood where the ashes once smoldered, a living symbol of resilience that could not be erased by fire or malice. David continued serving on the bench, his rulings marked by the same patience and principle that had carried him through his darkest trial. To those who appeared before him, he was not simply a judge, but a man who had lived the sting of injustice firsthand. That experience gave his words weight, his silences gravity, and his presence a quiet authority no robe or gavel alone could confer. But perhaps the greatest legacy was not the rebuilt home, or the headlines of Karen's conviction. It was the lesson etched into his children's memory, that justice is not a weapon for revenge, but a compass that must point toward truth even when it is painful, even when it is slow. They had watched their father endure humiliation, doubt, and fire itself, and emerge not hardened, but refined. He showed them that power is not the loudest voice in the room, but the one that remains steady when the world expects it to break. Here's what that moment teaches us. Life will hand each of us a Karen, someone who tries to erase our place, undermine our worth, or rewrite our story. And one day, life may also hand us the power to respond. The question is not whether we will win or lose, but what story we will leave behind in the process. Will we let hatred decide who we become, or will we shape the narrative through discipline, patience, and principle? A single action flipped David's entire outcome. The choice to document instead of retaliate, to prepare instead of explode, to hold fast instead of collapse. That same choice is available to each of us in our own battles, whether with a neighbor, a workplace, or a system. The challenge is simple but profound. Do not let those who wrong you define you. Let your response define them. If this story resonated with your values, if you believe in the quiet power of justice and the strength of resilience, I invite you to carry this lesson forward. Share it, speak it, and if you felt its weight, like, comment, and subscribe. Because every time we choose principle over vengeance, patience over fury, and truth over silence, we do more than win a battle. We shape a legacy. The fire took a house, but the man it was meant to break became a judge who lit the path for others.